For thousands of years, entire civilizations built monuments they believed would last forever. Yet many of them vanished so completely that even their purpose was forgotten. Why was the largest pyramid on Earth hidden in plain sight? How did a desert city defeat Rome and then disappear overnight? Why do imperial tombs, sacred mountains, underground quarries, and unfinished pyramids all point to knowledge we can't fully explain, or intentions we no longer understand? Were these failures, or messages we've misunderstood? What did these builders know about time, collapse, and survival that we don't? And if mainstream archaeology can't answer these questions, what are we still missing? Great Pyramid of Cholula. The Great Pyramid of Cholula rises not as a sharp declaration against the sky, but as a presence mistaken for landscape, a broad earthen mass softened by grass and time, so fully absorbed into the surrounding world that for centuries it was not recognized as architecture at all. And yet, when it was conceived, this place was not quiet or accidental, but alive with labor, ritual and expectation, built by people who believed their city would endure, that their gods would be honored continuously, and that the future would recognize what they had made. The intrigue begins with absence rather than spectacle, because unlike Egypt's pyramids, this structure, known to archaeology as Great Pyramid of Cholula, vanished in plain sight, expanding over generations into the largest pyramid by volume ever constructed, yet leaving behind no singular inscription, no clear founding narrative, and no definitive moment of completion, only layers upon layers of intention buried beneath later intention, until even its builders' descendants lost track of its true shape and scale. What remains is a stepped mountain of adobe brick, covering more than 40 acres, rising through at least 6 major construction phases, beginning as early as the 3rd century BCE, each phase enveloping the last, not replacing it, but entombing it intact, as though the past itself was never destroyed here, only covered and ritually preserved. Archaeological tunneling reveals these nested pyramids like frozen moments of belief, each aligned with subtle shifts in cosmology, each stage requiring enormous coordination, resource control, and sustained civic stability, all without the advantages of metal tools, wheeled transport, or draft animals, relying instead on human bodies, memory, and inherited technique. Cholula itself was one of Mesoamerica's longest continuously inhabited cities, a religious center whose influence extended far beyond its political power, and the pyramid functioned less as a tomb than as an axis, a constructed sacred hill echoing older mythic mountains where gods were believed to dwell, anchoring the heavens to the human world through mass and repetition rather than vertical height. Yet, for all this scale and continuity, the pyramid confounds modern expectations, because unlike monumental projects that culminate in a final form, Cholula's pyramid never seems to have been finished, only added to, as if its meaning lay not in completion, but in perpetual renewal, generation after generation reaffirming participation in a structure that could not be seen in its entirety even by those building it. The contradiction emerges when this immense effort is set against its historical erasure, because when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they recorded Cholula as a city of temples, yet they failed to recognize the pyramid beneath their feet, building a Christian church on its summit without realizing they were crowning the largest man-made structure on Earth, a misrecognition that endured for centuries, reinforced by vegetation, erosion, and the assumption that monumental civilizations must announce themselves in stone rather than earth. This raises uncomfortable questions for archaeology, because if a project of such scale could disappear simply by blending into its environment, then visibility itself becomes a fragile and misleading measure of importance, and the pyramid's invisibility suggests not a lack of sophistication, but a different relationship to permanence, one where meaning resided in process and ritual continuity rather than in leaving an unmistakable silhouette for distant observers. Even today, despite extensive tunnelling and study, there is no consensus on why construction repeatedly resumed after long intervals, nor why it ultimately ceased, nor how authority was maintained across centuries to coordinate such labour without a centralised empire comparable to the Aztecs or Maya at their peaks. Some scholars point to Cholula's role as a pilgrimage centre, where diverse cultures contributed offerings and construction as acts of devotion rather than state obligation, while others see the pyramid as a political stabilizer, a shared sacred project that absorbed social tension by redirecting energy into collective building. More unconventional theories speculate that the layered structure encoded astronomical cycles or calendrical resets, each expansion marking cosmological renewal after catastrophe, famine, or social upheaval, turning architecture into a physical memory of survival. There are even suggestions that the pyramid's gradual burial was intentional, that allowing it to become a hill was itself a ritual act, transforming architecture back into landscape, returning human effort to the earth as a sign of completion rather than abandonment. What complicates all interpretations is the absence of definitive collapse, because Cholula did not vanish suddenly, but thinned, adapted and endured, leaving behind a monument that outlasted the clarity of its own purpose. The pyramid's scale implies confidence in continuity, yet its final state suggests acceptance of impermanence, as if its builders understood that even the most massive works would eventually be misunderstood, repurposed, or forgotten. Standing today beneath the church that crowns it, the pyramid forces a confrontation with the limits of historical reconstruction, because tunnels can reveal walls and murals, but not intention, and measurements can quantify volume, but not belief. The Great Pyramid of Cholula remains a monument not to lost technology or mysterious power, but to a human willingness to build for futures that would never recognize the builders as they imagined themselves, leaving behind a silent mass that absorbed conquest, conversion, and neglect without protest, waiting centuries to be rediscovered, not as a marvel of engineering alone, but as a reminder that history often survives not by standing apart from nature, but by becoming indistinguishable from it. Hatra. In the arid plains of northern Mesopotamia, where wind erases footsteps almost as quickly as they are made, the ruins of Hatra sit inside a vast circular outline, not jagged or accidental, but deliberate, as if the city was once drawn with a single steady motion upon the earth, enclosing a functioning world that assumed continuity, protection, and divine favour, built by people who believed the sun would rise over their walls indefinitely, and that the gods who watched over them would continue to listen. The intrigue emerges not from what Hatra was, but from how it interrupts expectation, because this city, identified today as Hatra, does not fit neatly into the dominant imperial narratives of Rome or Parthia. Nor does it leave behind a linear historical record explaining how it rose so quickly, fortified itself so completely, and then vanished with such abrupt finality, leaving behind stone, but not memory. At its height between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, Hatra was a wealthy caravan city positioned along major trade routes linking the Mediterranean world to Persia and beyond, and its prosperity is written not in fragile texts, but in architecture, in walls more than 6 kilometres in circumference, reinforced by over 160 towers, and in monumental temples constructed from precisely cut limestone blocks, assembled without mortar, yet locked together with an understanding of load and stress that suggests long experimentation rather than improvisation. At the city's heart stood a sacred precinct dedicated primarily to Shamash, the sun god, where towering iwans, vaulted halls open on one side, rose with a confidence that rivals later Islamic architecture, their scale implying both advanced engineering and a civic consensus that religious space deserved the greatest investment of labour and skill. Inscriptions carved in multiple languages, Aramaic, Greek, Parthian, testify to a population fluent in cultural hybridity, capable of navigating competing identities while maintaining local autonomy. And the city's circular plan itself appears to be more than defensive, echoing cosmological models in which sacred order radiated outward from a divine centre, turning urban space into a physical map of belief. Yet for all this sophistication, Hatra resists simple categorization, because it was neither a provincial outpost nor a capital of empire, and its political structure seems to have balanced kingship, priesthood, and merchant power in a way that allowed stability without full imperial absorption. This balance is underscored by its historical role as a city that successfully repelled repeated Roman sieges, including those led by Emperors Trajan and Septimius Severus. An almost unthinkable achievement for a desert city confronting the most formidable military machine of the ancient world, suggesting defensive strategies, logistical coordination, and morale that exceed what its limited textual footprint would predict. The contradiction sharpens when one considers how such resilience could coexist with such fragility, because despite withstanding Rome, Hatra ultimately fell in the mid-3rd century to the Sasanian Persians, and shortly thereafter was abandoned, not gradually diminished, but effectively erased from history, its population dispersed or destroyed, its temples left to the sun and wind, and its name reduced to a whisper in later chronicles. Archaeology offers no definitive account of why Hatra was not rebuilt, why its sacred centre lost relevance so completely, or why its strategic position could not be reclaimed by successors, especially when nearby cities continued to thrive. This absence forces a confrontation with the limits of conventional explanation, because military defeat alone rarely erases a city so thoroughly, and the scale of abandonment suggests a deeper rupture, possibly religious, political, or cosmological, that rendered the place unusable or even taboo. Some scholars propose that Hatra's identity was inseparable from its role as a sacred city under divine protection, and that once that protection was perceived to have failed, the city's symbolic legitimacy collapsed, making reconstruction unthinkable to survivors who interpreted its fall not as chance but as cosmic judgment. Others point to shifting trade routes and imperial consolidation that bypassed independent hubs like Hatra, turning autonomy from strength into vulnerability, while more speculative interpretations suggest that internal social fractures between priestly authority and royal power, or between local tradition and imperial influence, may have weakened the cohesion that once allowed resistance against external threats. There are also theories that environmental changes, water management failures, or deliberate destruction of infrastructure made resettlement impractical, though evidence remains fragmentary, reinforcing the sense that Hatra's disappearance was not the result of a single cause, but of an alignment of pressures that modern analysis struggles to reconstruct. What remains particularly unsettling is how quickly Hatra passed from lived reality into myth, becoming associated in later folklore with curses and divine retribution, as if memory itself resisted preservation, and how for centuries its ruins stood largely unexamined, known but not understood, until modern archaeology began to peel back layers of silence. Even today, after extensive study, the city's purpose feels incomplete, because its architecture suggests long-term planning, its defences imply confidence in endurance, and its religious monuments radiate assurance rather than desperation, all pointing to a future that never arrived. The damage inflicted in recent decades, when parts of the site were deliberately destroyed, adds another layer of loss, repeating the ancient erasure in modern form, and reinforcing the city's role as a symbol of how easily human achievement can be undone when meaning collapses. In the end, Hatra stands as a reminder that civilizations are not only built on stone and strategy, but on shared belief in continuity, And when that belief fractures, whether through conquest, theological rupture, or historical amnesia, the most formidable walls offer no protection. The circular city of the sun god remains open to the sky, its geometry intact, but its story incomplete, inviting reflection not on how it was built, but on how entire worlds can vanish once the assumptions that sustained them quietly dissolve. Bent Pyramid. At the edge of Egypt's desert plateau at Dashur, the bent pyramid rises in quiet isolation, its pale limestone sides catching the sun in a way that feels hesitant rather than triumphant, as though the structure itself paused mid-thought. And in that pause preserved the outline of a world that expected stability, continuity and mastery over stone, built under the reign of a king who believed his name would move cleanly from the realm of the living into eternity without interruption. The intrigue of the bent pyramid lies not in its scale, but in its visible uncertainty, because unlike the smooth, confident geometry that later pyramids would project, this monument, known formally as the bent pyramid, changes angle halfway up, shifting from a steep ascent to a gentler slope, a decision frozen permanently into its form, announcing that something went wrong, or at least did not proceed as planned, in one of the most ambitious architectural experiments of the ancient world. Built during the reign of Pharaoh Sneferu in the 4th dynasty around 2600 BCE, the pyramid represents not a culmination but a process, a transitional moment in which Egypt was still learning how to transform royal ideology into enduring stone. Evidence suggests that Sneferu commissioned multiple pyramids during his reign, investing extraordinary resources into refining form, technique, and symbolism. And the bent pyramid stands as the most revealing of these attempts because it exposes the trial and error behind what later generations would mistake for timeless perfection. Its lower section rises at an angle of roughly 54 degrees, dangerously steep for a stone structure of such mass, while the upper portion relaxes to about 43 degrees, reducing stress and stabilizing the weight above, a change that required recalculating loads, redesigning casing placement, and adapting labor organization mid-construction, all while the pyramid was already towering over the desert. Internally, the structure is equally unusual, containing 2 separate entrance systems and a complex network of chambers with corbelled ceilings, suggesting experimentation with pressure distribution and burial design, as if the builders were probing the limits of what stone could be persuaded to do. Unlike earlier step pyramids, the bent pyramid was intended from the outset to be a true smooth-sided pyramid, clad in fine white limestone, much of which still survives today, offering a rare glimpse into how these monuments originally gleamed, not as ruins, but as blinding symbols of cosmic order and royal permanence. The labour required was immense, involving tens of thousands of workers, seasonal coordination with Nile floods, quarrying, transport, and precise alignment, all undertaken within a society that believed the king's successful transformation into an eternal being was not optional but essential to maintaining the balance of the universe itself. And yet, despite this ideological certainty, the pyramid's altered profile betrays anxiety, revealing that the builders confronted structural failures, cracks in the core masonry, instability in the casing, subsidence in the foundation that forced them to abandon the original plan rather than risk catastrophic collapse. The contradiction emerges sharply here because the civilization that produced the bent pyramid is often portrayed as operating with absolute authority and divine confidence. Yet this monument records hesitation, adaptation, and compromise, suggesting that even under divine kingship, knowledge was accumulated through failure as much as success. Some Egyptologists argue that the change in angle reflects lessons learned from the nearby Maidum Pyramid, another Sneferu project that partially collapsed, prompting engineers to prioritize stability over symbolic steepness, while others propose that time pressure, perhaps related to the pharaoh's advancing age, forced a pragmatic decision to complete the monument quickly rather than perfectly. Still others suggest that geological factors at Dashur, including softer subsoil compared to Giza, made the original design untenable, revealing limits imposed by landscape rather than imagination. What complicates interpretation is that Sneferu did not abandon pyramid building after the Bent Pyramid. Instead, he commissioned the nearby Red Pyramid, which adopted the shallower angle from the outset, and stands as Egypt's first fully successful true pyramid, implying that the Bent Pyramid was not a failure but a necessary experiment, a massive prototype constructed at full scale. This raises unsettling questions about cost and intention, because to modern sensibilities, the idea of experimenting with entire mountains of stone seems irrational. Yet within the logic of ancient Egypt, the process of refinement may have been inseparable from the expression of royal power, demonstrating that the king could command resources sufficient to absorb mistakes without consequence. Speculation extends beyond engineering into symbolism, with some researchers suggesting that the dual angle may have held cosmological meaning, representing the horizon or the primeval mound rising from chaos, while more unconventional theories propose that the Bent Pyramid was never meant to be finished in a conventional sense, serving instead as a ritual structure marking transition rather than completion. There are even interpretations that see the pyramid as a reflection of political negotiation, balancing priestly demands, labour realities, and royal ambition into a compromised form that nonetheless fulfilled its essential function. Yet none of these theories fully resolve the unease the structure provokes, because the Bent Pyramid remains unique, an anomaly preserved rather than corrected. Its very survival implying that it satisfied enough of its purpose to be accepted as complete, despite deviating so visibly from the ideal it helped define. Standing before it today, one is confronted not with the certainty of ancient mastery, but with the evidence of learning in progress, a civilization feeling its way toward permanence without knowing in advance which solutions would endure. The Bent Pyramid thus occupies a rare space in human history, where the scaffolding of knowledge was never removed, where the adjustment itself became the final form, and where a society that believed deeply in eternal order inadvertently left behind a monument to uncertainty. It remains there still, its silhouette bending under the weight of its own ambition, reminding us that even the most confident cultures build their futures through moments of doubt that stone alone cannot conceal. Yangling Mausoleum. Beneath the cultivated fields outside modern Xi'an, where wheat grows in orderly rows and the surface gives little hint of what lies below, the Yangling Mausoleum extends quietly through the earth, an invisible city constructed for a ruler who assumed that death was not an ending, but a continuation, a transition into another domain that required governance, ritual, labour, and preparation just as life had, and whose subjects believed that the stability of the living world depended on the orderly passage of their emperor into the next. The intrigue of Yangling lies in its restraint, because unlike the towering spectacle of the first emperor's tomb nearby, this burial complex associated with Emperor Jing of Han was designed not to dominate the skyline, but to disappear beneath it, hiding one of the most elaborate funerary landscapes in Chinese history, beneath an ordinary-looking earthen mound that concealed intention rather than proclaiming power. Constructed in the 2nd century BCE, during the Western Han dynasty, the mausoleum was not a single tomb, but a carefully planned underground realm, stretching across dozens of pits and satellite burials, replicating an entire imperial economy in miniature, complete with administrators, soldiers, servants, animals, tools, and storehouses, all positioned to continue their functions eternally. Excavations reveal thousands of terracotta figures, smaller and subtler than those of the Qin dynasty, many originally clothed in real silk garments that long ago decayed, leaving behind bare ceramic forms whose missing arms and faded pigments hint at a realism that time itself has erased. These figures were not meant to impress the living, but to serve unseen, reflecting a philosophical shift toward moderation and balance that defined Emperor Jing's reign, a period marked by consolidation, reduced taxation, and the deliberate softening of imperial excess after the brutality of the Qin. The mausoleum's layout mirrors this ideology, emphasizing order, hierarchy, and continuity rather than overwhelming force. With pits arranged according to administrative function and ritual significance, forming a subterranean bureaucracy calibrated to maintain cosmic and political harmony beyond death. Archaeological evidence suggests that construction began early in Jing's reign and continued for decades, requiring sustained coordination of labour, resources and ritual knowledge, all in service of a future that could not be witnessed or corrected once sealed. The contradiction emerges when this immense investment is weighed against its invisibility, because despite the scale and complexity of Han Yangling, it left no monumental marker comparable to pyramids or mausolea elsewhere. And for over 2,000 years it remained largely unknown, ploughed over by farmers who unknowingly walked atop an emperor's afterlife. This challenges modern assumptions that power always seeks visibility, suggesting instead that for the Han elite, legitimacy derived not from spectacle, but from alignment with cosmic principles that did not require constant reaffirmation through stone and height. Even more unsettling is how little textual guidance exists to explain the precise symbolism of the mausoleum's design, leaving archaeologists to infer meaning from placement, proportion, and absence, rather than from explicit declarations of intent. Why were some figures headless, others armless, designed to be completed only through perishable materials? Why were entire functional systems recreated underground with such care, only to be sealed away permanently? Conventional explanations frame the mausoleum as a reflection of Han beliefs about the afterlife, as a mirror of earthly existence. But this alone does not account for the precision nor for the emotional restraint embedded in its execution. Some scholars argue that Han Yangling represents an anxiety about continuity, a recognition that stability required constant management even beyond death, turning the tomb into a mechanism for preserving order against the inevitability of decay and political change. Others suggest that the mausoleum reflects a compromise between older traditions of human sacrifice and newer ethical norms, replacing living servants with ceramic stand-ins, preserving function without bloodshed, yet still demanding enormous human effort in production and planning. More speculative interpretations see the mausoleum as an early expression of bureaucratic thinking taken to metaphysical extremes, where governance itself becomes eternal, stripped of individual personalities and reduced to roles, ranks, and procedures frozen in clay. What complicates every theory is the sheer calmness of the site, the absence of apocalyptic imagery or overt divine. Iconography as though the greatest fear was not judgment but disorder, not punishment but discontinuity. Unlike tombs that celebrate conquest or divine lineage, Han Yangling feels administrative, almost procedural, as if eternity itself was something that could be managed through proper planning and resource allocation. The open-ended mystery deepens when one considers that the mausoleum's effectiveness was never meant to be evaluated, its success defined by faith rather than outcome, sealed away with no witnesses and no possibility of revision. In this way, Han Yangling exposes a profound human impulse, the desire to extend systems beyond the lifespan of their creators, to believe that structure can outlast memory, and that order, once properly arranged, will sustain itself indefinitely. Today, as glass walkways allow visitors to look down upon the silent ranks of figures beneath their feet, the mausoleum resists easy interpretation, offering no grand narrative of triumph or tragedy, only the quiet residue of a civilization that trusted in continuity so deeply that it buried its future beneath the earth. Han Yangling remains not as a monument to death, but as a record of how carefully humans prepare for futures they will never see, convinced that the invisible will endure long after the visible world has moved on. Geghard Monastery. Carved into the living stone of Armenia's Azat Gorge, where cliffs close in and sunlight reaches the ground only in narrow intervals, Geghard Monastery does not announce itself as a construction so much as a revelation. A place where architecture appears to have been uncovered rather than built, formed by a community that believed sacred permanence was best achieved not by rising above the earth, but by retreating into it, anchoring faith directly within the mountain that surrounded their lives. The intrigue of Geghard emerges from this reversal of expectation, because unlike monuments that assert dominance through visibility, this complex, known today as Geghard Monastery, conceals much of its achievement within the rock itself, demanding proximity and patience rather than awe from a distance, and in doing so raises unsettling questions about how belief, memory and survival were imagined by the people who laboured here. Tradition traces the site's origins to a sacred spring long before Christianity reached Armenia, suggesting that the gorge was already understood as a threshold between worlds, a place where water, stone and shadow converged in ways that inspired reverence. And when Armenia became the first officially Christian kingdom in the early 4th century, that older sanctity was not erased but absorbed, layered beneath new theology, much like the chambers carved one within another inside the cliff. The name Geghard, meaning the spear, refers to the lance believed to have pierced Christ's side, a relic once housed here, and this association infused the monastery with spiritual gravity that extended far beyond its remote location, drawing pilgrims, patrons, and protection across centuries of instability. The evidence of sustained intention is written directly into the stone, where churches, chapels, burial chambers, and monastic cells were not assembled from blocks, but hollowed out with extraordinary precision, their walls bearing crosses, rosettes, inscriptions, and acoustic properties that amplify chant into something almost disembodied, as if sound itself were meant to circulate endlessly within the mountain. Construction spanned generations, particularly during the 12th and 13th centuries under the Zaccharid princes, requiring not only religious devotion but advanced understanding of geology, load distribution, and long-term planning. Because mistakes in rock-cut architecture are irreversible, each strike of the chisel committing the builders permanently to their design. Some chambers descend deep into darkness, their ceilings carved to imitate wooden vaults they did not need structurally, suggesting that replication of familiar forms mattered even when function did not demand it, anchoring spiritual continuity through visual memory rather than innovation. Tombs carved for noble families sit within the same rock as sanctuaries, collapsing distinctions between worship and burial, life and death, and reinforcing the sense that the monastery was not merely a place of ritual, but a complete cosmological environment designed to hold human presence across time. Yet the contradiction becomes apparent when one considers how vulnerable this place was, situated in a region repeatedly contested by empires, invaded, taxed and destabilized, and yet Geghard endured, not through fortification or concealment alone, but through its deep integration with the landscape itself. Armies could burn surface structures, but they could not easily erase what was part of the mountain. And this resilience complicates narratives that frame survival purely in terms of political power or military strength. At the same time, the monastery's survival feels almost improbable because it depended on continuous belief, patronage, and maintenance, all of which could have failed during periods of upheaval, yet somehow did not entirely disappear. This raises deeper questions about intention. Was carving into stone a conscious response to impermanence, a recognition that written records, wooden roofs, and even cities could vanish while mountains endured? Or was it an act of humility, a theological statement that human presence should be subordinate to creation rather than imposed upon it? Scholars debate whether the rock-cut spaces were meant to symbolize Christ's tomb, the womb of the earth, or the ascetic ideal of withdrawal from the visible world. But none of these explanations fully account for the complexity and scale of the project, nor for the aesthetic care invested in spaces meant to be dim, hidden, and accessible only to the committed. Speculation extends further when considering the monastery's acoustics and light control, with narrow openings allowing shafts of illumination to strike specific surfaces at particular times, creating an environment where sensory experience reinforced theological concepts without words. Some interpretations suggest that Geghard functioned as a living scripture, its architecture encoding belief through movement, sound, and darkness rather than text, making the act of inhabiting the space itself a form of instruction. More unconventional perspectives propose that such sites served as cultural anchors during periods of fragmentation, preserving identity not through centralized authority, but through embodied ritual repeated in spaces that resisted alteration. What remains unresolved is why such extraordinary effort was devoted to a site so deliberately withdrawn from visibility, and why its builders trusted that future generations would continue to recognize and care for what could not easily be seen or understood from the outside. In this way, Geghard exposes a tension at the heart of human monument building, the desire to endure without insisting on recognition, to preserve meaning without guaranteeing interpretation. Today, as visitors descend into its chambers and hear voices echo against stone carved centuries ago, the monastery offers no clear explanation for itself, only an atmosphere shaped by belief, labour, and time. It stands as a reminder that some civilizations prepared for the future not by projecting themselves forward in monuments meant to be seen forever, but by embedding their faith into the earth itself, trusting that even if their names were forgotten, the mountain would remember. Mausoleum of Augustus. On the northern edge of Rome's ancient campus Martius, where traffic now flows and modern life presses in from every side, the Mausoleum of Augustus sits heavy and circular, a mass of brick and stone that once redefined how power imagined its own future. Built not at the end of a life, but at its beginning, by a man who assumed that stability, memory, and continuity could be engineered as deliberately as conquest itself. The intrigue begins with timing, because this monument, known as the Mausoleum of Augustus, was commissioned by Augustus in 28 BCE, decades before his death, at a moment when Rome was still reeling from civil war, and the future of its political experiment remained uncertain, suggesting that this structure was never merely a tomb, but a statement about permanence made in an age defined by collapse. Augustus did not inherit a stable world. He inherited fragmentation, fear, and exhaustion, and the mausoleum rose as a counter-argument, asserting that Rome had entered a new era where power would no longer be temporary, violent, or forgettable, but ordered, inherited, and eternal. Architecturally, the structure was unprecedented in Rome, a massive circular tumulus inspired by Etruscan burial mounds and Hellenistic royal tombs, layered concentrically around a central chamber, once crowned with earth, trees, and a bronze statue of Augustus himself, transforming death into a visible extension of civic space rather than a private conclusion. The scale alone was staggering, over 90 meters in diameter, dominating the flat expanse of the Campus Martius, deliberately positioned so that processions, rituals, and daily life would orbit the presence of the imperial dead. Inside, Niches awaited not only Augustus but his family, embedding dynastic continuity into stone and geography, ensuring that Rome would associate political stability with biological succession. Inscriptions once flanked the entrance, including the Res Gestae, Augustus's own account of his achievements, replicated across the empire, merging architecture, text, and memory into a single program of self-definition. The mausoleum thus functioned as a machine for legacy, designed to control how the future would remember the past by anchoring narrative to mass, location, and ritual repetition. Yet the contradiction becomes apparent when one follows the structure forward through time rather than backward into intention, because despite its ambition, the mausoleum failed almost immediately to secure the continuity it promised. Augustus's dynasty fractured within a generation, Rome's political system drifted toward autocracy, and the mausoleum itself became crowded, contested, and eventually neglected, its symbolic clarity eroded by the very history it sought to master. By late antiquity, the structure was abandoned, stripped of its decorative stone, its purpose forgotten or ignored, repurposed as a fortress, then a garden, then an arena, its interior filled with soil and debris until its original function became archaeologically obscure. This transformation exposes a tension at the heart of imperial monumentality. The belief that meaning can be fixed through form, even as social systems remain unstable. The mausoleum was built to normalize eternity, yet it could not prevent reinterpretation, because monuments do not enforce memory, they merely offer themselves to it. Scholars debate whether Augustus underestimated the volatility of Rome's political culture, or whether the mausoleum was always less about actual continuity and more about projecting the appearance of it during a fragile transition. Some argue that the structure's circular form symbolized cosmic order and cyclical time, presenting Augustus not as a tyrant, but as a stabilizing axis around which Rome could reorganize itself after chaos. Others see it as an act of anxiety, a recognition that legitimacy required physical reinforcement, that memory alone was insufficient in a city accustomed to erasing its leaders through damnatio memoriae and civil war. More speculative interpretations suggest that the mausoleum functioned as a territorial claim over Rome's future, embedding imperial presence into public land so deeply that no successor could disentangle power from Augustus's image without dismantling the city itself. Yet, history demonstrates that dismantling was precisely what happened, not through sudden destruction, but through gradual indifference, as the monument's symbolic language lost relevance to new belief systems, new political structures, and new populations who no longer read the same meanings into its form. Christianity reoriented Rome's understanding of death and legacy. Medieval rulers found the structure more useful as a defensive stronghold than as a tomb and renaissance. Romans treated it as a quarry or spectacle, each era overwriting the previous one without fully erasing it. This layered reuse reveals an irony at the core of Augustus's project. In attempting to control the future, he ensured that the mausoleum would remain useful precisely because it could be reinterpreted, not because it fixed meaning permanently. The open-ended mystery deepens when one considers that, despite centuries of neglect, the mausoleum was never fully destroyed, as if its mass itself resisted disappearance, surviving long enough to be rediscovered and restored in the modern era. Not as a functioning tomb, but as a historical artifact, stripped of its original authority. Today, standing amid traffic and apartment blocks, the structure no longer instructs Romans how to remember Augustus. Instead, it invites reflection on the limits of intentional legacy. The mausoleum remains as evidence that even the most carefully engineered memories are subject to time's indifference, that power can plan for eternity and still be absorbed into layers of unintended meaning, and that monuments built to stabilize history often end up recording its instability instead. Cave of Zedekiah. Beneath the northern edge of Jerusalem's old city, hidden behind an unassuming entrance and sealed for centuries by rubble and silence, the Cave of Zedekiah opens into darkness, not as a natural void, but as a deliberate subtraction. A place where stone was removed so methodically that absence itself became the record of human intention, carved by people who believed their city would endure, that its walls and temples would stand for generations, and that the labour performed in shadow would support a visible future above. The intrigue of the cave lies in this inversion, because known today as Cave of Zedekiah, and traditionally called Solomon's Quarry, it preserves no monuments, no inscriptions, no dedications, only the negative space left behind by construction on the surface, forcing modern observers to confront a vital but largely invisible foundation of ancient urban life. Stretching nearly 5 acres beneath the city, the cave bears the marks of chisels, wedges, and organised extraction, its walls scored with parallel cuts that testify to systematic quarrying over long periods, likely beginning in the First Temple era and continuing intermittently through Roman times. The limestone removed from here, known as meleke, was prized for its strength and workability, and it is widely believed to have been used in the construction of Jerusalem's fortifications and monumental buildings, binding the cave's darkness directly to the city's most sacred and contested spaces. In this way, the cave functioned as a silent partner to history, supplying material without claiming authorship. Its existence assumed rather than recorded, its labour absorbed into walls that were meant to project permanence and divine favour. The tradition linking the cave to King Solomon and the First Temple reflects an ancient intuition about continuity, a belief that sacred architecture must be sourced from consecrated ground, even if that ground lay hidden beneath the city itself. Yet what archaeology confirms is not legend, but scale. The cave's vast chambers, supporting pillars left in place to prevent collapse, and channels carved to manage water seepage all point to advanced planning and long-term use, implying an administrative system capable of coordinating extraction, transport, and construction without leaving behind a centralized narrative of control. The contradiction emerges when this immense infrastructural effort is weighed against the cave's historical disappearance, because after centuries of use it was sealed and forgotten, its entrance obscured until its rediscovery in the 19th century, even as the city above it was conquered, destroyed, rebuilt and reimagined countless times. This raises unsettling questions about what societies choose to remember, because while Jerusalem's surface monuments became objects of devotion and conflict, the space that enabled their existence slipped entirely from cultural awareness, as if support systems themselves were not worthy of memory. The cave's association with Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, adds another layer of tension, rooted in the biblical account of his attempted escape through a cave during the Babylonian siege, an act of desperation that ended in capture, blinding, and exile. Whether or not this cave was the literal route of escape, the symbolic alignment is powerful, a subterranean passage linked to collapse, flight, and the end of a kingdom, standing beneath a city that would repeatedly face similar cycles of hope and ruin. Scholars debate whether the cave's sealing was intentional, perhaps to prevent structural collapse or unauthorized access, or whether it was simply abandoned as quarrying shifted elsewhere. But the absence of clear evidence leaves interpretation open, reinforcing the sense that this space exists on the margins of documented history. Some researchers propose that the cave held ritual significance, citing later traditions that describe it as a place of mourning or secret assembly, while others emphasize its purely utilitarian origins, arguing that its mystique is a projection imposed by later generations searching for meaning in absence. More speculative perspectives suggest that underground spaces like this served as psychological counterweights to monumental architecture, reminding societies, consciously or not, that every act of construction depended on hidden extraction, that every symbol of divine order rested on material taken from the earth and permanently removed. What complicates all readings is the cave's atmosphere itself. Its vastness swallowing sound, its humidity preserving echoes of movement, its darkness erasing orientation, creating an experience that feels deliberately set apart from the city above, even if that separation was never intended. Symbolically by its original users. Standing inside, one senses not catastrophe but duration. The slow accumulation of effort without ceremony, generations of workers shaping space they would never inhabit, contributing to structures they might never see completed. The open-ended mystery deepens when one considers how perfectly the cave embodies the fragility of historical continuity, because while temples and walls were destroyed and rebuilt, the quarry endured unchanged. Its purpose fulfilled and then forgotten, waiting centuries to be rediscovered, not as a source of stone, but as a source of questions. Today, lit by artificial lights and visited by tourists, the cave of Zedekiah resists definitive interpretation, hovering between infrastructure and legend, labour and loss, reminding us that civilizations are upheld as much by what they remove as by what they erect. It remains beneath Jerusalem, not as a monument to kings or gods, but as a quiet testament to the hidden work that makes history possible, and to how easily the foundations of permanence can slip into darkness once the future they were meant to support fails to arrive.